Hi, everybody. I'm so glad we have power. I thought, we might miss a lecture, which would suck for everybody. But thankfully, the powers that be have released the power, pun intended. So today we're going to finish off. And so what that means is that I wasn't able to actually go through my lecture ahead of class today because I didn't have it on my computer. So it may be a little rough around the edges, not as smooth, but hopefully we'll get through this. So we're going to finish up our lecture on neuroanatomy. We may not get to the entire content, but keep remembering that I've built in extra time towards the end of the lecture before the midterm to have a little bit more space for spillover, so we will get through all the content before the first midterm. So I believe last class I ended on this slide, and we were just taking you through all the different anatomical regions in the different parts of the brain. So we were in the brainstem, and we had gone through the hindbrain. Now we're finished in the midbrain. And the next region is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is located more dorsal, so it's actually more superior in the brain. And it really has two main regions, the hypothalamus and the thalamus. For those of you in my 1201 class, you probably are cued to the hypothalamus because we spent a lot of time talking about it yesterday. But the hypothalamus is a very small group of nuclei. So remember what nuclei are. They're clusters of cells that has a very big role in human behavior. Namely, it's involved in motivated behaviors. And it does so by virtue of the fact that it is kind of the master brain region in controlling for the release of hormones. So it is connected to what is known as the pituitary gland, which is one of the major glands of the human body. Okay. Weird. Okay. So it makes connections to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases hormones into the bloodstream and does some funky stuff. So things like feeding. So every time you have something to eat, or if you are finished a meal, you release hormones into your bloodstream that tell you, hey, I'm full, or no, I need to be eating more. And then that's done by virtue of the hypothalamus. Sexual behavior is also mediated by the hypothalamus. Sleeping, temperature regulation, and emotional behavior. So you can imagine that this very small region of the brain does a lot of things. So it would be very bad to have damage to parts of the hypothalamus. And in fact, on the lectures on sexual behavior, feeding and eating and sleeping, I'll talk about sometimes what happens when you have damage to regions of the hypothalamus. So this is a ghosted in figure. It's not from your textbook, showing exactly the location of the hypothalamus, and it's right in here. So it's kind of sort of at the bottom of your frontal lobe and connecting your frontal and temporal lobe. So the thalamus, which is, so the hypo means below. So the hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. And here's actually a better picture here that shows a sagittal section, sagittal view into the brain. And here's that brain stem and the corpus callosum. And here's an inset showing you a blow-up of this region of the brain. You can see here is the pituitary gland, which is connected to the hypothalamus via the pituitary stalk. And you can see that the thalamus right here sits above the hypothalamus. And the thalamus does some really important functions. Namely, it's considered the gateway to the sensory system. So every time you have incoming information via your sensory systems, vision, audition, sight, smell, touch, taste, all the incoming nerves that come into the brain first land in the thalamus. So they go to the thalamus, and the thalamus is like a relay station. It says, okay, auditory information, you need to go to this part of the brain. Visual information, you go to this part of the brain. So it takes in the sensory information and sends it off to the appropriate cortical regions that mediate that particular sense. So its primary role is sensory processing. It does a little bit of motor processing as well. So motor information coming via the motor cortex will go out to the thalamus before it goes out to the rest of your body to guide motor control. And as a result, it also has an integrative function, because it makes sense that you need to integrate your visual information with your auditory information in order to guide movement. Right? I hear something over in this part of the visual world, I see it, I'm going to move toward it. So you're going to have a part of the brain that integrates that information in order for you to accomplish that basic task. You should also know that the thalamus is bilobed, which means it has two lobes. You have a right side and a left side, and that controls, again, for the left and right side of your body, not respectively, so right side for left, left side for right. And again, it's subdivided into a number of different nuclei, not unlike the hypothalamus, and each of these nuclei do a very specific thing. So for example, the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus is responsible for visual processing. The medial geniculate nucleus is responsible for auditory processing, etc. You don't need to know that. I'm just giving you examples. So moving up into the brain, we've gone from, again, the hindbrain, the midbrain, the diencephalon. Now we're going to end up in the forebrain. And that's the forebrain is the major portion of the brain, right? Remember my brain model from last class, which I forgot to bring today. It is most of what we think of when we think about the brain. So the forebrain has three principal structures. The neocortex. Neo means new, cortex means bark. The neocortex is the last layers of the surface of the brain. So it's these layers of cells that really are primarily responsible for our sense of consciousness. We say anytime something hits the neocortex, we're aware of it. It's responsible for the highest level of cognitive processes that we do as humans. Language, memory, thought, these things are handled by the neocortex. It is another portion of the forebrain is the basal ganglia, and ganglia is yet another fancy word to describe a group of interconnected nuclei. And so basal means below. So here you can see that's ghosted in purple. These are the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, you'll hear all throughout the term. So again, this is why the final exam is cumulative, because you need to know where the basal ganglia are, and you need to know what its functions are, because it's not only involved in movement, but also a number of different functions that we'll get throughout the term. But primarily, it's involved in voluntary movement. So every time I want to take a step, the basal ganglia is implicated in that. When you drive a car, your basal ganglia is really what's promoting the ability to do this automatic behavioral response. And what you'll learn is that if you have damage to the basal ganglia, this can be quite problematic. An example is Parkinson's disease. So for those of you that haven't heard of Parkinson's disease, it's a neurodegenerative disorder caused by damage to some of the cells in the basal ganglia. People who have Parkinson's disease can't initiate voluntary movement. So you say, walk up that step, they can't do that. But if they don't think about it, they can do it. The other group of structures that are in the forebrain are the limbic structures. And we'll learn a lot more about the limbic system when we get to the lecture on motivation and emotion. So right now, all I want you to know is there's a group of structures that together comprise the limbic system. So things like the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cingulate cortex. Again, you'll learn all of that much later on, but it's a group of structures that taken together, we know are involved in motivation and emotion. So again, if you have damage to any of these regions, you start to get some funky things happening with motivation and emotion. Yes?
You were saying that if they don't think about it, then they can do it. What do you mean by that?
If I give them the instruction, you need to walk up these stairs, they can't do it. But if the person just so happens to be walking and they see the stair, they'll just do it. It's very strange. And there's some, I don't have time, but there's some really interesting videos that you can see on YouTube where they do exactly that. They ask the man to cross the line and he's sitting there shaking. and then they get him to disengage and just start walking, and then he ends up just crossing the line.
Yeah, so what happens in the basal and ganglia? Like, if they think about it, it goes through it. If they don't, it just like...
It is extremely complex. We do grad level classes on this. So we'll save that, okay? But just know that it's a very sophisticated system that acts like a seesaw. You need just enough inhibition and just enough excitation. You throw a little bit of inhibition off, it throws the whole system out of loop, because it's not just the basal ganglia. It's the basal ganglia connected to the motor cortex, connected to other parts of the brain, which form loops. Anyway, so if you're interested, yes, PhD. There you go. So just a little bit more on the cortex. Again, this should be, to some extent, review for those of you that have taken Psych 100, which I think all of you need to have taken for this class. But once again, cortex comes from the Latin word for bark. And as you know, bark on a tree, it forms layers, and meaning with the layer that's closest to the outside is the most recently developed layer. You can tell how old a tree is based on the number of rings to their cortex, not unlike what's seen in this figure here. So here is an example of the layers of the bark, with this outermost layer being the newest layer. And this is definitely the case, again, with the brain. So you can see here in gray, the grayed out region is the cortical region. Okay? So the cortex covers the entire forebrain, and it is the last few layers of these cells. So this is a blow up showing what would happen if you had, this is again a coronal section, and what this would look like if we examined it with a microscope. So you can see all these different cell bodies here with all the dendrites and the axons, which you'll learn shortly. The final layer, as I mentioned, the neocortex, is the newest bark, and it actually is 6 layers of gray matter. And as I mentioned, it creates and responds to your perceptual world. We also have the limbic cortex, and the limbic cortex is kind of like a primordial or evolutionarily older cortex. So again, you can imagine as we've evolved as a species, species that are lower down evolutionarily will have limbic cortex, but they won't necessarily have neocortex. So limbic cortex is the precursor to neocortex. It consists of 3 or 4 layers of gray matter that control motivational states. And this is what is kind of covering those limbic regions. So we have neocortex and we have limbic cortex. And so again, what I mean by 6 layers is if you took a cross-section of the brain, starting from the surface of the skull here, you'd have very distinct, is that 6? Layers of cell populations that do very specific things. So this layer would do something very different than this layer, which does something different than this layer and this layer and this layer. Okay? And so the cell architecture is different. This slide is exactly exemplifying that. Right? So this is from your textbook, and here we're taking layers from the motor cortex on the left there, which is in blue, and the sensory cortex, which is in red. The layer that's closest to the surface of the skull would be layer 1. The layer deepest in the brain would be layer 6. And you can see, this is obviously a cartoon version, but how the cell density changes, right? So here, it's not as dense as layer 5, for example. And the cells that are in these specific layers do specific things. So layers 1 to 3 have integrative functions. Layers 4 in the sensory cortex and layer 4 in the motor cortex have sensory inputs, and layers 5 and 6 have outputs to other parts of the brain. So if we listened to those cells, if we had fancy electrodes, which we do, that recorded what these cells were doing, we would note that when sensory information is coming into our brain, layers 4 would be activated. When motor input is exiting our brain, these cells would be activated. Okay? So different layers have different cell types. The density varies in these layers. They also differ in appearance, which relates to their function. Without getting ahead of myself, the dendrites, which is the part of the neuron that receives information, we call it the dendritic tree. The more dense that dendritic tree, it means basically that that neuron is responsible for gathering information from a lot of different places. So this is why layers 4, 5, and 6 are really, really dense and have these great dendritic trees. We say that there is a cyto, meaning cell, architectonic map. And this is the map of the neocortex that is based on the organization, the structure, and the distribution of the cells, indicating, again, that these cell populations have unique functions. So that's why we cluster them into layers. Yes?
For the integrative function, would it integrate like separate output and then like pass it down to the different and send it out, or also integrating stuff from everywhere else?
Yes, integrating inputs from different sensory systems and also integrating input from motor afferents as well. Because what happens is that when I put out my arm, that is an efferent, right? It's an efferent signal. Put your arm out. But you also have to get the afferent signal coming back up, giving you feedback that your arm has been extended. If we didn't have that feedback, it would be very weird, right? That's why you can't tickle yourself, incidentally. When somebody else tickles you, you have an afferent copy, but you don't have the efferent copy. You have the incoming sensory information, but you haven't done it yourself. When you've done it yourself, you're aware that you're tickling yourself. That makes sense. So there you go. You learned why you can't tickle yourself today. So each of the hemispheres of the brain, again, so review, I hope, has 4 lobes, right? We learned this, I think, in high school. I never learned it in high school, but all my incoming students in first year learned this in high school, which is awesome. But just to remind you, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, each of them have 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, which here in this diagram is in blue, it is separated from the parietal lobe by what's called the central sulcus. Remember, the sulcus is a very deep, sulcus is the grooves in the brain. And the frontal lobe is the most recently developed part of the brain, and it has what we say it's like executive control. It's like the CEO of your brain. It's responsible for goal-directed behavior, planning, organization, and also inhibits a large portion of the back of your brain. So we'll learn that again with motivation and emotion as to why the frontal lobe is really important in motivational and emotional control. Your occipital lobe, which is the very back portion of your brain here in purple, is all vision. Your parietal lobe, again, which is located dorsal to your frontal lobe, is involved in tactile functions. It's what they say gives you your sense of self. So you see some really wacky things happening when you have damage to your parietal lobe. People, for example, have what's called contralateral neglect. They're in their hospital bed and they've had a lesion or a stroke to, let's say, the left half of their parietal lobe, and they feel like their right leg doesn't belong to them. So they want to throw it out of the bed. They're like, this isn't my leg, because they've lost that sense of self, right? So they feel like this is a stranger's leg in their in their bed. So they try and chuck it out of the bed. It's really wild. Contralateral neglect. They neglect everything to the half of the visual world or the sense of self that is opposite to the side of their lesion. The temporal lobe here in yellow, it's called the temporal lobe because it is located immediately behind your temples, and it has a lot of functions: memory, language. Here I've got more visual information, auditory information. Our main auditory cortical area where we process hearing is located right around here. Also your sense of taste, which is gustatory, is a fancy word for saying taste. So lots of things going on there. Music, math, very, very important. Ren.
I'm just wondering about that neglect thing. I actually saw a video on YouTube yesterday that had a woman, I'm not sure if this was the same thing, but she was told to, like, she had some sort of stroke. She was told to draw a cat, and then she only drew the right side of the cat, and then she thought it was complete until someone pointed it out. Oh, you're missing the half of the cat, and she goes, oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I've seen that video. Yes, it's contralateral neglect.
That's weird.
Yep. So they, or if you ask them to draw a clock, they stuff all the numbers of the clock onto the one side of the clock. Yeah, wild, wild, wild. Dave? Yeah, Dave.
What's the difference between the visual functions between the temporal and occipital lobe?
Excellent. You're thinking. Occipital lobe, here, most of it is very rudimentary visual processing. So when you're getting information, it reaches your occipital lobe first. That's your visual cortex. So the kinds of information that is done at that level is what color is the object? Is it moving? And where in space is it? Okay. Then the information branches out, and you can actually have two different pathways for vision. If you, this ventral pathway here is responsible really for identification of that object. So this is an orange. This is Dave. Information, there's also visual information that's processed in the parietal lobe, and that's the dorsal pathway, and that's involved in locating that image in space. So vision we devote a huge amount of cortical real estate for the processing of vision. And that's why we will talk about in the lecture on sensation and perception, mostly vision, and a little bit of audition and taste and smell if I have time.
Also, what about like